So CINA, as you can see, stands for Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis Center. The center is funded by the DHS S&T Office of University Programs through a 10-year cooperative agreement. We're entering year 8 of that agreement here. And we also have a basic ordering agreement that allows for more directive work from DHS as well as more sensitive work. And the work done under both the co-op and the BOA is all centered on pursuing approaches to better understand how to disrupt network criminal activity, particularly transnational organized crime. Under both of CINA's DHS agreements, we have a number of research projects executed by teams across the country. And these project teams are developing new methods and new tools and technologies, as well as trainings, curriculum, and knowledge products, like the team today, to support the Homeland Security workforce. Each project funded at CINA is centered around a DHS operational challenge or research question. And throughout the life cycle of each project, teams share their progress and work along the way, and also at the end through briefings like these, with the goal of getting the results into the hands of DHS and other law enforcement where the products of the research can do the most good. So if any folks in our DHS audience today have an idea for a research or training need that CINA might be able to help out with, please touch base with us anytime. We're always interested in hearing from DHS about any challenges we might be able to fold into an RFP that helps us spin up new projects. After I finish, I'll put a couple emails in the chat, and we'd be happy to have a follow-up conversation to learn more and talk about working with the center. So with that, let's move on to the research. The project presented today is led by Dr. Jodi Quas at UC Irvine and Dr. Allison Redlich at George Mason University. They've recently finished a multi-year project that analyzed a very broad variety of data sources to study the problem of interview reluctance in victims of trafficking. They've done really great work throughout the project. We're really happy to have them on the line today to talk about the results. We'll have some time for Q&A after the project presentation. So if folks have any questions along the way throughout, just feel free to drop those into the chat, and I'll help corral those at the end for a discussion. We are recording the presentation today to share afterwards, but we'll probably drop the recording for the Q&A portion so folks can feel free to have an open discussion. And with that, Jodi and Allison, I'd like to go ahead and hand the floor over to you and your team.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you to CINA and DHS for everything. This has been, I think, a really great and important project that we've been pursuing. And I think, the findings, I think, have really clear implications for both policy practice and also kind of academics in terms of kind of where we need to go next. So I'm going to share my screen and just kind of run through what we've been doing and some main findings, and hopefully this will prompt a really exciting and interesting discussion with everyone. So let me, I'm hoping everyone can see the screen. If not, someone will have to interrupt because I can no longer see anyone but the screen. So again, thank you so much. This is a project that Allison Redlich and I have been pursuing for many years. And really, I think at the start, what I want to do is kind of highlight just what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to talk about the challenges, give you a little background to our work, and then tell you about the different projects that we've pursued with support from CINA. I'll highlight some of the key results and then talk about its application and how we can continue to use the work to impact change and improve identification and intervention following exposure to trafficking. All right, so at the start, one of the things I do want to make sure it's very clear is that our work is really centered and has kind of as a core component, we're really trying to make sure that we are consistent with DHS and HSI goals. One of the big goals is sort of this counterterrorism and homeland security threats. And within that, there are efforts and kind of support to collect, analyze, and also share actionable intelligence. The specific objective that our work falls under is really directly about preventing, identifying, investigating, and ideally disrupting human trafficking, child exploitation, and other exploitation-based crimes, both through law enforcement and victim-centered approaches, but also really thinking about how do we utilize and collect evidence to facilitate prosecution. as well. Now, kind of as a backdrop, as many of you know, human trafficking is a global, national, but it's also a local problem. And the reason it's kind of falling under all these domains is that traffickers aren't just one monolithic group. Traffickers include some opportunistic individuals, but also to highly sophisticated cross-national crime syndicates. And with both of these, what's happening is that there are kind of this growing awareness within the United States and across the globe about this problem. And with this growing awareness has been kind of a growing effort directed towards addressing the problem. And you can see these efforts in campaigns to increase awareness. There are, dozens of special investigative teams and prosecutor units across the country now, both at the local but also the federal level. There's changes in legislation all the time, beginning, of course, with the TVPA, which was first passed in 2000. So all of these efforts are really directed towards addressing the problem of trafficking. And so you can see this, anyone who has traveled through an airport or a bus station might see some of these advertisements like the sex trafficking one. They might see pictures. People always know about really well-known movies, which is really a kind of increasing public, but also ideally professionals' knowledge of kind of that trafficking exists, that we as a nation, communities, both law enforcement and others really need to be addressing this problem. Well, there's a challenge with this. And the challenge is that oftentimes those awareness campaigns don't match reality. And so if you think about those images of the kind of kidnapped victim, the middle class, white girl who's on vacation in Europe, or kind of the scared and frightened and physically restrained victim, that doesn't match actual victim characteristics. So when you look at actual victims, both at the local level, but also even these cross-national victims, many of them have significant histories of adversity. Some are undocumented. They might be from a minoritized racial or ethnic group, or come from LGBTQ groups. Many are adolescent age. In fact, most trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, both within the United States and also cross-nationally, most begin in the early adolescent years. And with these histories, kind of adversity exposure, undocumented, there's oftentimes kind of maltreatment history. They might have been in the foster care system. And there's these repeated contacts that victims have with the authorities, not necessarily due to trafficking, but instead due to their potential engagement with delinquency and crime. As a result of all of this, what happens is you have victims who are highly mistrusting of authorities. And so when victims don't trust the authorities, there can be quite a challenge in attempts to obtain information from those victims, both to identify them and also to prosecute perpetrators. So kind of here's this challenge that we've seen from our work, but also in talking to individuals in law enforcement at the local and federal level. There's this disconnect between what the perceptions of victims are and what actual victims look like. And this disconnect creates an enormous challenge because we might not be looking at the correct characteristics and identifying the actual victims because we're looking for these perceptions of the victims that don't exist. And you can see these, you can even see this on some of the campaigns, even at the federal level. So if you look at some of the myths and misconceptions and some of the awareness videos, even on something like the Blue campaign, they're presenting victims as kind of, and failing to acknowledge this high level of mistrust that victims seem to have with anyone who's trying to intervene and provide support. So with that backdrop, what we've been trying to do is really think about, are there better ways of identifying suspected victims? Can we, if we can identify them, then what we have to do is we really have to find ways of encourage them both to talk about their experiences, but also to cooperate when we're trying to intervene and support them, but also prosecute perpetrators. We also, if victims are mistrusting, we need to think about how we can improve prosecutions to enhance their success when victims are kind of mistrusting and are really unwilling to cooperate. And to do that, we really need to look at kind of broader types of evidence. And if we can do that, then what we can do is we can kind of enhance identification of an intervention for victims, and then we can lead to more successful prosecutorial outcomes. So that's the backdrop of where our work came from, both in terms of the DHS goals, but also in terms of some of these challenges that we're seeing in perceptions versus actual victims. So what we then did many years ago is we designed a multi-phase series of projects that are really designed to address some of those different aspects of the challenges and needs that we saw. So what we did in our first phase is we actually kind of took this kind of bird's eye view and we looked at trial transcripts. We actually collected appellate cases from California, where I'm located, and we looked at what are the characteristics of victims and defendants and cases, what types of evidence are they reporting. And what we wanted to do is we really just wanted at the start to look at, well, how do these victims, who tend to be adolescents, compare with victims who are the same age in other types of sex crime cases. And in our case, it was sexual abuse with adolescent age victims. So we began there by analyzing these trial transcripts. Then what we did is we found some particular characteristics in those analyses that led us to conduct a broader nationwide survey of law enforcement investigators to really see what they were doing and when they were attempting to elicit information from victims, and also what challenges they saw and what attempts they were making to overcome those challenges. In the third phase of the project, then what we did is we really panned really far out, and we actually conducted an analysis of what was going on at the federal and then state court level. We looked at trends in prosecution, excuse me, from 2000, when the TVPA was passed, all the way to 2020. And we again did these comparisons to see how successful were prosecutions at the federal level in relation to other types of sex crimes, thinking about sexual abuse and also child pornography cases. And in the final phase, what we did, we went from this very broad kind of analysis of federal cases, and we actually are now going into detail and looking at court documents on the types of evidence, looking both at kind of evidence, what types of evidence they're reporting. We're also conducting more in-depth interviews, qualitative analyses of prosecutors. So that way we have some ideas from law enforcement, but also now we're looking at directly for prosecutors, thinking about what they need, what challenges they're facing, and what they're doing to overcome those challenges. So those are the 4 phases of our project. And what I'm going to do now is just give you a snapshot of some of the key findings from each of these phases. So as I mentioned in the first phase, what we did is we were looking at California criminal cases prosecuted on both trafficking, but also sexual abuse of minors. And what we were really interested in is what's unique about these criminal cases of trafficking, and what are unique characteristics of the victims. To do these, we were very strategic, and we actually did a public records request. We contacted DA's offices across California, and we collected all criminal cases involving a child sex abuse or a minor trafficking charge that went to trial in California across a 6-year period. Then what we did is we identified subsets of these cases that resulted in a guilty verdict. Then we went even further and we found the subset of cases that were guilty at trial, and then they were appealed, and they had a written opinion available in that we could then analyze. California is a right to appeal state, and so virtually all cases that end in guilty verdicts are appealed. And then what we did for this specific part of the project, for the CINA project, is we actually were analyzing some of the details in those opinions, comparing the sex abuse and trafficking cases, all with adolescent victims. So it was really this sort of funnel approach, and what we were interested in is really looking at some of the details in these appellate decisions, which are sort of the details of what's standing out as important in the cases at the appellate level. So what we did in the legal opinions, they actually contain multiple parts. They have the reason for the appeal, but they also have a summary of the facts of the case. And then there's a legal analysis relevant to the appeal. What we did is we were really interested in these facts of the case as summarized in these appellate opinions. We were looking at, did they mention something about the victim details? Did they mention something about the victimization or other case details? Were they talking about manipulation techniques, how it was discovered, etc.? And we went in and we actually reviewed these appellate opinions for all of this information. So the analyses that I'm just going to show you today, we had 41 cases involving trafficking of a minor, and we matched those to 59 cases involving an adolescent, roughly similar age victim. And you can see here there's slight differences in the ages. And kind of these cases oftentimes had more than one victim, which is why you see the total number of victims being slightly higher. Just to kind of give you some of the kind of characteristics of these victims, which I think goes to kind of some of the challenges that you're going to see come up later, is first of all, when you look at how the victimization, how the exploitation or sex abuse was discovered, in most situations of sexual abuse, it's discovered because the victim discloses. Whereas with trafficking victims aren't disclosing themselves. They're not coming forth to say what happened. It's oftentimes through police identification, stings, or police picking up victims on the streets. But right off the bat, the discovery is really different in these two cases. When you look at these appellate opinions, 23 of the 67 cases, so that's almost, a little over 30% of the victims uncooperative is actually mentioned at the appellate level, whereas that occurs really infrequently in sex abuse cases. They also frequently mention that the victims have delinquent behavior. They mention the victim's earlier experiences more in trafficking compared to sex abuse. And then in contrast, they actually mention the family being supportive in sex abuse far more often. So even at this level, what you see is you already start to see these hints that the victims are really characterized very different in trafficking cases than sex abuse, with quite a few hints of sort of uncooperativeness, that the victims are, explicitly uncooperative. They're delinquent, they're not disclosing. And so because of this, what we were then interested is, well, what other types of evidence are they reporting in these appellate decisions that seem to be important in the cases? So what we coded for is just mention of electronic evidence, prosecution expert, defense experts, and defendant confession. And so what you can see here is that electronic evidence plays a really important role in trafficking, but not necessarily sex abuse cases. And so do prosecution experts, which is really interesting because in sex abuse cases, you see some of them. What you tend to see with child sex abuse, which we've shown in other work, is that it usually is defense experts talking about children's suggestibility. But here it's prosecution experts. And when we dug a little further, what it looks like is it's usually experts that are explaining the victim's history and behavior. So kind of explaining why the victim might be uncooperative, the victim is, has a delinquent background. And kind of so explaining why the victim might be mistrusting. And that seems to be important, or at least coming out far more often in these trafficking cases and the sex abuse cases. Okay, so overall, what that first phase suggested to us was that number one, trafficking victims seem especially uncooperative. But number two, that we really need to think about what we can do to enhance kind of cooperation kind of improve interviews, possibly to encourage victims to participate more fully, to disclose, to further help those cases. And if you think about the cases that we just analyzed in California, those were the successful cases. So you can imagine that this uncooperativeness, a lot of those characteristics are far more common when cases aren't successful or aren't appealed. So in our second phase of the project, what we did is we actually looked at that idea of sort of what can we do to improve interviews. And we realized we don't really know anything about what's happening in the interviews at all from a kind of broad scientific perspective. So what we did is we actually, in the second phase, conducted a nationwide survey of law enforcement. And we collected federal, state, and local law enforcement. We had a wide range of participants. I should say that CINA and FLETC were really helpful in distributing our survey here so that we could collect a wide range of respondents. The survey was, covered a wide range of topics. We did ask participants just about their general knowledge of adolescence, trafficking, and interviewing. We asked about what types of challenges they encountered. We also gave them kind of some vignettes and asked them about kind of strategies that they might use in response to different types of vignettes. What we did is we asked them what they look for when they identify a potential victim. So they looked at background characteristics. What's interesting is they looked for someone being in charge. They didn't look at prior maltreatment or delinquent behavior, which is interesting because those are very kind of common in victimized traffic samples. They did talk a lot about kind of the behavior in the interview. You see evasive in 36%, age-appropriate sexual knowledge and behavior in smallers. But what's interesting is that really this evasiveness and hostility is really prevalent. And so you can see that even here, it's the rates are slightly lower than you might expect. They also looked at other forms of evidence, like cell phone fake IDs. When we looked at what challenges they encounter, they actually, even though they're not calling it a sort of something they look for to recognize when a victim is present, what you see, this was a scale from 1 to 5, kind of higher ratings being what was kind of more important as a challenge, or what do they see as a bigger challenge. What you can see, and the only thing I want to note here is that they absolutely recognize that the victims that they encounter distrust the authorities and are evasive. So the most common is that the victims don't trust them and victims don't want to talk. And they see these as especially problematic. When we asked them, though, what they do to overcome these, we had really over half mentioned the relationship, building trust. And I think that's really important, and that's consistent with a lot of other evidence from other fields talking about how do you encourage and engage high-risk adolescents in interventions, in therapy, in school, et cetera. And it really is this idea of trust and comfort. So law enforcement absolutely recognize that that's also important with these youth victims. They also recognize the need to attend to their safety and basic needs. So sometimes it's more important to just make sure they're safe. Do they need sleep? Do they need medical attention? Maybe they need an STD or a pregnancy test. Kind of attending to those before you do the interview can go a long way towards building trust. And then the other one that was common was reinforcing and reminding the minor that the minor's a victim, which is interesting because it really kind of circles back to the idea that there are these incorrect perceptions among people that victims know they're victims and are happy to be rescued. With this idea of reinforcement, it's suggesting that at least law enforcement recognize that victims don't know that. So with that, what we kind of conclude is that law enforcement seems to recognize interview challenges and how to respond. So with this recognition, though, has this translated into kind of better evidence collection and better prosecutions? or in terms of at least success. Excuse me. So what we did in this third phase is we actually looked at that idea of success. And the way that we approach this in our third phase is we actually went back into administrative data, and we collected federal prosecution data from 2000 to 2020, just before the pandemic started. And we looked at prosecution rates, success defined by guilt as being a guilty outcome, in trafficking cases. And then we also wanted to see, if we're going to look at trafficking cases, we couldn't really interpret those trends without also looking at other types of cases, because maybe trafficking trends just follow everything else. So we wanted to know if there was something unique about trafficking relative to other types of crimes. So what this first graph shows you is the results of this huge administrative data set. And so what it shows from 2000 to 2020, the red, this is the total number. And if you can kind of imagine for a second, the most common type of federal case prosecuted, far more common than trafficking, is child pornography cases, which makes sense when you think of sort of sending illegal images across state lines. So what you have in kind of the 2000s, which corresponds to the increased use of the internet, but also kind of get tough on crime policies that were ongoing, you see this huge increase in child pornography and sex abuse. You also see an increase in trafficking, although that increase kind of occurs a little bit later. Then you see a really big drop in the number of cases kind of in the past, from probably 2017 up. So, and that has this actual pattern is very consistent with prosecutions in general, which have all followed this same pattern. Just to kind of show you, though, percentage-wise, because the actual raw numbers are so different, when you look at percentage of cases, which makes sense, the TVPA was passed, so you actually, that's when trafficking could be prosecuted. So it's not surprising that percentage-wise it's so low in kind of the early 2000s. But what you see with trafficking is there was this huge ramp up between kind of 2012 and about 2016. And then again, trafficking, the percentage of cases prosecuted dropped significantly, similar to others, but a slightly different kind of timing of it. So kind of to summarize, the two graphs just are showing the same numbers differently. There's this increase and then decrease in federal prosecutions. And these trends, parallel kind of trends for all other crimes kind of going on in the United States in terms of prosecution at the federal level. It's just the timing varies a little bit between trafficking and the two other types. But what's also interesting is not just number of cases prosecuted, but the number of guilty outcomes. Because what you might expect is that as prosecutions were going down, we're gaining more knowledge about trafficking. What you might see is we're taking on, we're accepting fewer cases, but we're more successful with those cases because we're getting more knowledgeable about how to collect evidence, how to prosecute the cases. We're forming special prosecutor units, we're forming task forces. So one would assume the percentage guilty outcomes would be increasing, even though the total numbers are decreasing. Instead, we saw something different. So again, the red is child pornography. What you can see is when you look at just the percent of guilty outcomes, you can see that over time that's been increasing slightly. So over time, it looks like even though we're taking on fewer cases, the cases that they're taking on and being able to prosecute, prosecutors are successful with child pornography. Child sex abuse, you see a fairly similar trend where it's this gradual increase, although also a leveling off of percent of guilty outcomes. All of these are high because prosecutors generally don't take cases unless they feel pretty confident in their ability. But what you see for trafficking, you see a lot of variability at first, but what you also see is that guilty outcomes are not improving. So even though the percent of cases that they're actually accepting for prosecution is dropping, we're not getting better at prosecuting the cases that they do accept. So to summarize that, it's sort of guilty outcomes are increasing slightly for child pornography and sex abuse, but they're remaining stable for trafficking, including since 2015 when the number of cases has been dropping. So prosecutors aren't necessarily more selective in picking the cases where they have stronger evidence, and they're not getting better, which I think points to kind of the next phase of our study, but also it points to important ways that we can think about how do we use these data to improve identification and prosecution. So given that these overall numbers of prosecutions decreased while success did not increase, what we wanted to do then was we were like, let's go back in and let's look at prosecutors' experience and evidence in more detail to see if we can better understand this. And what that did is led to our fourth phase. So in this phase, we've been focusing on prosecutors, both perceptions and evidence. So our fourth phase, which we're actually pursuing right now, we're in the kind of analyses phase of it, is we conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with prosecutors who had experience with trafficking cases. And what we were interested in from prosecutors is we actually had a kind of a wide range of questions, but we're interested in their thoughts about the evidence, what their challenges are, what they see as things that have changed, whether they're getting better, what they need. So we really tried to cover a wide range of topics through these in-depth interviews. And then what we're now trying to do is really extract them to see among these prosecutors with considerable experience, what do they say about evidence? What do they say about challenges? What do they say about their needs? At the same time we're doing that, we also collected administrative data on evidence in the state of Virginia, and we're actually coding for what evidence is reported in cases to see whether the patterns of evidence are similar across case types. Again, going back to this trafficking, pornography, and sex abuse. And what we're hoping is by merging and kind of combining the in-depth interviews and the administrative data, we can really hone in and identify, what prosecutors need to make sure that they are kind of identifying cases that have strong evidence and that they're able to prosecute those cases successfully. So that's sort of the main projects that we've been pursuing with support from CINA and from DHS. What I wanted to mention, though, because we have these comprehensive projects going on, that what we've also been doing at the same time is we've been pursuing some other projects funded by other agencies to really try to make sure that we're getting the most comprehensive understanding possible. So with one of our other projects funded by the National Science Foundation, we've actually formed a partnership with Homeland Security specialists, the interviewers who actually conduct the forensic interviews with suspected trafficking victims, and some local police. And we've been analyzing the actual interviews. So rather than only conducting surveys of law enforcement, asking them what they think, we're actually now able to look at, well, what are interviewers actually doing, including interviewers from HSI who have considerable expertise with these populations. And because our survey was really highlighting that law enforcement saw trust and kind of comfort as being really important early, we've been looking at rapport building in particular to see how rapport is built and how that relates to victim reluctance. In addition, and again, kind of thinking about this idea of perceptions versus what actual victims are like, we've actually expanded our surveys. And instead of just looking at law enforcement, we're actually now looking at what other professionals know about victim identification and interviewing, or kind of, to use the terms common to these other professions, history taking or conversations with teens. And we built on that law enforcement survey to really see, are these other professionals recognizing common victim characteristics, and what do they do when they encounter suspected victims. So what we've really tried to do with all of these is really get these kind of from different angles and different perspectives and different data sources, get a comprehensive understanding of what's being done and what's needed to increase our ability to identify and intervene on behalf of these victims and facilitate prosecution of perpetrators. But in addition to just collecting the data, I think what's really important is that we have to get the information out there to the people who need it, who are making decisions, and who are on the front lines. And we've really taken a multi-pronged approach to this. Allison Redlich and I are academics, so of course, we go to academic audiences. We have done lots of conference presentations at academic conferences, but also multidisciplinary conferences spanning law, psychology, medicine, social work, and even education. We've also really made an intense effort on all of the phases to involve students and postdocs who've also presented findings, who are co-authors on publications, and who are now getting out there and doing presentations kind of for diverse audiences as well. We have a number of publications that are finished. We're actually working on a few more on that phase 4. So again, that's really our academic components, but that's not all we've done. What we've also tried to do is really engage stakeholders, not only within the United States, but broadly. We regularly present at conferences, we do presentations, we do lots and lots of trainings and workshops, trying to really make sure that professionals on the front line in law enforcement, in kind of the justice system broadly, for judges, attorneys, and then also now for victim advocates and other groups of professionals like healthcare and school professionals, that they are receiving the information so that they can make better decisions. We also are trying to kind of create simple, more digestible kind of one-pagers. An example is the fact sheet that we put out about a year and a half ago, kind of on some of the key findings from this work. And what we're hoping is by putting this out there, we're at least raising awareness of some of the actual challenges that are encountered when victims are being identified and cases are being prosecuted. All right, and so with that, I apologize. I was talking pretty fast, but I just wanted to say thank you again to CINA and to DHS for funding these projects and for helping us kind of make sure that we are engaging and kind of communicating our findings and getting and hopefully getting feedback so that we can continue with this work and we can all continue to pursue DHS's goals and objectives.